Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's research seminar, which is being hosted by the Center for Transportation Studies here at the University of Minnesota. My name is Linda Prisen, and I'm the Director of Research Administration at CTS. Just to give you a little context, CTS is hosting a number of seminars this fall semester, to be exact, and this is the first one in that set of seminars. So we'll have one every week between now and November 8th, and they'll be held here in this room in Mechanical Engineering from 3:30 to 4:30, and they'll feature a number of transportation-related topics. The seminars are free and open to anyone who's interested in transportation, in particular other researchers and students. I see a number of students here today, as well as practitioners and anyone else who's interested in the topics. This particular seminar is being held in conjunction with the meeting of the CTS Transportation Planning and the Environment Council. So we just got done with our business meeting, and now we're moving into the seminar portion of the meeting. And a schedule of the remaining seminars is available on CTS's website, and we also send out announcements ahead of time that provide abstracts and other details of the seminars. So a couple of just quick items before we get started. Wanted to mention that this seminar is being recorded and broadcast on CTS's website. So you do see a camera in the back of the room, and you don't hear my voice projecting into this microphone, but this microphone is being used to project to our remote audience. And so if you know of somebody who couldn't attend today but is interested in this topic, we'll be also recording the webinar for later viewing. So in addition to having it online right now, people will be able to view it after the fact, so you can pass that information along to those who may not have been able to join us today. Because this microphone is used so that our remote audience can hear, and it is being heard with the webinar later on for recording or for viewing purposes, we'd ask you to use this during the Q&A. So if you're in the room, I'll come around with the microphone, or Joe will, and we'll have you talk into this microphone, and even though it's not projecting, you'll be able to be heard. And we would ask that you save your questions to the end of the seminar as well, and we'll have an opportunity for our remote viewers to type questions in. We don't usually get a lot of those types of questions, but every once in a while we do. So I guess at this point, I would like to introduce the CTS Planning and Environment Council Chair, who just chaired her last meeting, actually. Connie Kozlak from the Metro Council will be introducing today's speaker. So I'll invite Connie up at this point to give a brief introduction.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased today to have two people that I've known for a while that are great transit researchers for us. Jason Cow is the Assistant Professor and Dean Scholar at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and his research includes transportation and land use interactions, environmental correlations of public health, transit planning, and connections between telecommunications and travel. He has a bachelor and a master's degree from, I may not get this right, Tsinghua University in Beijing. And he also has a master's and a PhD from the University of California in Davis. And he has been here now, doesn't say in his resume, about what, 4 years, 5?
6. This is my 6th year.
Anyway, he has been doing some great transit research for us, and this is just one in a series of studies he has done. And he also has with him today Jessica Schoner, who has been working on this with him. I have known Jessie since she started at Humphrey Institute, and she is working on a joint degree also with civil engineering. Her research interests include bike sharing systems, non-motorized transportation networks, and the transit last mile program. How do you get to where you're really going if the transit line doesn't take you right to your door? And she received her bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in math from the University of California in San Diego. And she's been here, what, 3 years now? This is my third. I remember her first year, and we were all kind of teasing her about, are you ready for winter? But she stuck it out. So here you go. I believe you have your own mics, right? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Connie. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming, and what a big crowd. I'm a little bit nervous. Okay, and today, we are going to have two talks. But before we talk about our presentation, and I want to thank, the following agencies and individuals. So first, this research is supported by the Transitway Impact Research Program in the Twin Cities. And I want to thank, the technical advisory group members for their support and their comments regarding this research. And also we get the support from the Hennepin County planning the planners, and also from the planners in the city of Minneapolis. And after my presentation, and Jesse is going to talk about the lateral transit and the walking. So this slide outlines my talk. First, I'm going to introduce the background about this study, and then I'm going to talk about the methodology and discuss the result, and finally, I'm going to make conclusion and give you some implication for this research. The rail transit has been touted as an effective way to increase ridership, reduce congestion, as well as promote economic development. So you can see there is a proliferation in the rail development in the United States. For example, if you look at the New Star program, we can see in fiscal year 2013, there are more than 30 projects have received and has been pursuing the federal grants from this program. And also, some agencies, they just cannot wait. So in that case, they pursue, their rail transit programs through their own local funding or public-private partnership. And in the Twin Cities, we also see a booming of the rail transit development. So I think most of you know this 2030 Transitway map. So you can see here, we have the Hiawatha LRT transit is on operation, and also we have the North Star commuter rail. And of course, we know the Massey University Avenue, this is construction of the Central Corridor LRT transit. And then, we cannot wait the Southwest LRT transit. And also, the Baltimore Transitway is close to come up with locally preferred alternatives. So you can see, we see so many, things, in the Twin Cities. And also, the rail transit represents the very expensive, the investment. So in that case, the planners and the public want to know what are the transportation impacts of the rail transit on the transit use. Of course, we want to look at the literature. We want to see what evidence is available. And in a paper published in 2006, Land and her colleagues studied the transit urban development in California. And then after studying that site, and they found out the station area residents use transit for commute and non-work trips about 5 times and 3 times as likely as residents in the surrounding cities. And also there's some other, evidence at different scales. So you can see, they compare to the countryside or compare to the regional residents. So from this group of research, we can see, the previous research is really trying to compare travel behavior for the people living in the station area, and then the behavior of the residents living in the city, county, or region as a whole. But I see a potential problem with this approach, because the rail transit often replaces a high-frequency bus routes. And sometimes it may eliminate some of those parallel bus corridors. So in that case, we want to make sure we have the feeder service to this rail transit. So in that case, you can see, this situation, and then if we try to compare the station area with the city, county, and the region as a whole, so in that case, we may overestimate the impact of the rail transit on transit use. So, an ideal case, we need to find a control corridor, and then that corridor is similar to the rail corridor in terms of the location context, in terms of the building environment attributes, and also, the demographic information, and also it's well served by bus transit. So I think, this is a fair comparison. And then another thing regarding this type of research is, the people come to the rail transit for different reasons. Some for rail, some for other reasons. So in that case, we speculate, the people, moving into those neighborhoods, may have different reasons, and then they may show different pattern in terms of transit use. So in this case, we talk about the movers and non-movers. Because for the non-movers, they move to the Hiawatha corridor before the opening of lateral transit. So they may not come there for that transit. And then for the people, move after the opening of the Hiawatha transit, and then they may for that transit. So in that case, may show different, the pattern in terms of transit use. So in that case, it's very important for us to consider the movers and non-movers separately. So in this case, this study, we try to, address these two gaps in the literature, and then we want to find out, what's the object, we want to find out the impact of the Hiawatha LRT transit on the transit use, and also we want to find out the difference between the movers and non-movers. So the data used in this study come from a self-administered survey, in May 2011. So, the focus corridor is really the Hiawatha LRT transit. So this is the map from the Metro Transit website. And then you can see, we have three major sections about this Hiawatha LRT transit. In the north part is really the downtown Minneapolis, and south part is the Mall America and then the MSP International Airport. So on the both sides is heavily in terms of the commercial use and institutional use. And then in this study, we try to focus on the middle part. This is the residential neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And then we focus on the study area from the Lake Street, 50th Street. And of course, we get the data from the movers and non-movers. And finally, we have about 22% of the response rate for this study. So this figure shows the geographical location of the Hiawatha corridor and also the census block groups, we studied. And so you can see, street network along this corridor is really kind of the grid, is a grid network. And also, with, okay, let's move on. So, and then we try to come up with a control neighborhoods. And then for this, the control neighborhoods, we talk to the planners in city of Minneapolis. And then, finally we chose the Nicollet Avenue and then the Bluetooth Avenue as the controls for this Hiawatha because they were built, approximately at the same time, and also the demographic information are really similar. And then if you look at their, the street network pattern and also other attributes, land use attributes, they are really quite similar. Of course, there's no two same corridors, but they are kind of closest to the Hiawatha corridor. So we use them as our urban control. And later on, I'm going to tell you, we used two suburban control. And then for those two suburban control, we choose the neighborhoods. One is in the Coon Rapids, and then the other one is in Birdsville. And then for these two suburban control neighborhoods, they have similar in terms of demographic information, but they have quite different building environment attributes. For example, they have the curvilinear street, and then they don't serve with very well, in terms of the transit service. And in terms of the variables used in this study, we use the commute trips by transit and also the number of trips by transit. And also we have the demographic information for those residents. In terms of the methodology, we use propensity score matching. So in that case, we try to match the people in the Hiawatha corridor with the people in the control corridors in terms of their demographics. And if you want to know more about this methodology, we can talk about this one later. And then in terms of the result, from this analysis, we can figure out the treatment effect of the light rail transit on the transit use. This is the impact of the light rail transit on transit use. And also, we try to separate the impact on the movers and non-movers. Now, I'm going to show you some result. And first, I want to show you how to read this table. You can see the rows. The first one is frequency commuting by transit. So this is the number of trips per month they use for the commute. And then the second one is probability of commuting by transit. So no matter how frequently you use transit, as long as you use transit, and then you are a transit commuter. So in this case, we talk about the probability. As long as you use the transit, you have ever used the transit as commute mode. So this is second. And then, of course, for the next two, that's for the number of trips. We have the same meaning, the number of non-work transit trips per month. And then, have you ever been a user, transit user? And then the second column, this shows the observed difference. So this one is really, okay, we have, for example, the Hiawatha corridor, and then we have the urban control corridor. We calculate the mean, and then we compare these two means, and then we want to see the difference. And then the next column shows the PSM treatment effect. So this one is, we control for the demographic information, do the matching, and then we come up with the treatment effect. So this is the impact of lateral transit on transit use. So you can see here is, for example, if we look at the commuting, so that number is 1.228. So that means for the residents living in the Hiawatha corridor, on average, they use transit about 1.2 trips per month more frequently compared to the residents in the urban control corridor. And this difference is statistically significant. Now let's look at the last column. This one shows us the practical importance of that effect, how big of that effect. And then we try to compare this treatment effect with the average usage of control residents. So that means actually you can see this lateral transit increase the transit use by about 65% for commute trips. And then when we look at other variables in this table, and in general, we find out the non-Moore Hiawatha residents are more likely to take transit and take transit more frequently than non-Moors in the urban control corridors. This is good news, right? So we see the increase in transit use among the non-Moors. How about the Moors? And for the Moors, we didn't find this pattern. So you can see for the commute trips, yes, we do see an increase about 0.5 trips on average, but it's not significant. And then when we talk about the non-work trips, in fact, it's negative. So that means it's reduced compared to the residents living in the urban control corridor. But on the other hand, we find out the probability, this one is significant and positive. So that means, for the people living in the Hiawatha corridor, they have our use transit, but they just don't use it frequently. They use them, but not frequently. This table shows the transit use, commute transit use between non-Moors and Moors. So let's look at the urban control corridor. So you can see, for the non-Moors, they use the transit on average 2.2 times per month. And then for the Moors, they use 3.4 times. And also the difference between these two is significant. So that means the Moors, they use transit more frequently than the non-Moors. And then when we look at the Hiawatha corridor, the non-Moors and the Moors, we didn't really see a significant difference between these two groups of people. Yeah, what's the reason? Maybe, for the non-Moors, the Hiawatha actually increased their use. And then this table shows the comparison between the Hiawatha corridor and then the suburban corridor. And then if you see this, both numbers, so you can see, compared to the residents living in the suburban corridor, the Hiawatha residents, they use transit more frequently than the residents in the suburban corridor. And then the difference in terms of use is consistent with previous studies. We just talked about, about 3 or 5 times. So from this study, we found out the lateral transit ridership is available for the non-Moors. It's significant. And then the size of that influence is about 50 to 80%. It's much smaller than the 3 to 5 times compared to the previous study. So that means the previous studies dramatically overestimate the impact of the rural transit. And then for the non-Moors, we found out, the result is insignificant. So that means the lateral transit has a limited ability in attracting heavy transit users. And then you may wonder why. Okay, so in that case, we want to see what's the implication of this research. If our goal is try to facilitate transit use among station area residents, the first lesson we learned from here is because transit use depends on the development around the rail stations. So the planners should think about the development when they think about the rail transit route. Okay, let's look at the Hiawatha. Hiawatha corridor is a destination connector. So that means it's connecting downtown, West Campus, and then MSP International Airport, and we have the Mall of America. But in terms of the station area, so you can see it's built along an industrial corridor. And those industrial use hinders the development around the rail station. And also the existing commercial use are auto-oriented. So this is really not for pedestrian. So if we don't see the development potential, and then we are going to see the problem associated with not really attractive in terms of the new residents. And then the second is we want to maximize the connection between the neighborhoods and the station area. People, they need to walk to the light rail station. So in that case, we want to create a pedestrian-friendly environment. But, in this case, we can see, there's a separation between the eastern part of the site and then the light rail transit. So we can see, we have a state trunk highway, and then we have the industrial site. We have the rail tracks serving the site, and then Minnehaha. So that means for the residents living on the east side, they need to cross all those barriers and then come to this light rail station. And then another lesson is regarding, if we look at the design of the transit station, this design is a mode. This is a mode in the transportation network. So that means people come here just to get the transit, instead of we are making a vibrant place. Okay, so that means this station area is not really a destination. This is a mode. This is not destination. So there's no reason for me to come there to do something. The only thing is, okay, take the light rail transit. And then, if we want to facilitate the transit use, it's very important to have this affordable housing and also the displacement prevention program. Between 2000 and 2010, there are about 1,000 new housing units in the Minneapolis neighborhoods. But the vast majority of them are the market rate housing. Market rate housing is really for choice riders. The choice rider, yeah, they use transit, but they just don't use transit frequently. So in that case, if we provide affordable housing, so in that case, we can attract the highway transit users. So that's going to increase the transit use. And also, because the Hiawatha LRT transit has increased the property value along this corridor. And then that may push some of those residents out of the station area. So actually, we reduce, the base for the transit user, right? And then the next, if the goal for the light rail transit is really try to promote modal shift, but in fact, I think the Hiawatha LRT transit does contribute to this modal shift, especially for these choice riders. For many of those choice riders, they live in a place. There is no this choice. There is no this option. So they want to use transit, but because there is no option, so that means they have to use automobiles. But now, because we have seen the new housing development along this corridor, and then that enables them move into those neighborhoods, and then try to match their travel preference. Now they can use the transit, right? Otherwise, they are going to drive. So from this perspective, we do see the Hiawatha LRT transit, encourage the modal shift from automobile to transit. So this slide concludes my presentation, and now I'm going to hand it over to Jessie, and she's going to talk about the light rail transit and walking.
Hey everyone, and thanks so much to Jason for setting me up with why transit's important and why this corridor matters. So we just heard all about how the light rail corridor affects transit ridership. We also want to look into how the Hiawatha light rail affects walking. And why walking, you might ask? Well, Jason just said, you need to be able to walk to the corridor, and that's how you take transit. So if you can't actually walk to the corridor, walk to the station, you might not use transit all that much. So we just heard how transit corridors are these major investments going into a corridor. You're paying both for the infrastructure and for all these corridor improvements that have the potential to make that transit corridor a much nicer place to walk to the station. Well, walking is pretty popular these days too. We've also seen a pretty big push for non-motorized transportation as a strategy to shift people out of their automobiles. We just saw the conclusion of the non-motorized transportation pilot program. There's a lot of money here too, and it has a lot of benefits. I'm sure you're familiar with these. And so what's this relationship? Aside from the fact that people walk to the transit station. Well, there's actually a lot of evidence that these two are pretty closely related. Ewing and Cervero did this really awesome study where they looked at about 200 previously conducted studies about the built environment and travel behavior, and they found that a lot of built environment features that support transit are the very same ones that support walking trips in their own right. And they've classified these into sort of density, land use diversity and mix, and street network design factors. And so you look at, the same characteristics that make it easy for you to walk to the transit station also make it easy for you to walk to the store, go for a stroll around the block, and really build walking into your lifestyle. In particular, this might seem kind of surprising, but the presence of a transit facility at a bus stop or light rail station, that proximity, of course, it predicts using transit. It also predicts walking pretty well. So this is pretty important, and then that leaves us with the question, are we just seeing this relationship between transit and walking because the built environment supports both, or is there a unique relationship between transit and walking? And there have been some studies on this too. Transit has an environmental effect. You put this corridor in and people can walk to the station, and so we've got these two studies here. One's a longitudinal study that looked at people's behavior before and after installing a new stop along an existing light rail corridor. And they found that people's walking increased quite a bit because they started using transit a lot more. And another study looked specifically at health outcomes. They found that after the opening of this light rail corridor, residents were much more likely to get their recommended 30 minutes a day of physical activity from the health department. So the transit facility really seemed to have an effect there. So just, long story short, you increase transit ridership and you're almost by definition increasing walking because people are getting to transit. There are also these carryover effects that we see evidence of in some research. That Brown and Werner study from the previous slide also found that people were making additional walking trips above and beyond what they were doing just to get to the transit station. And they had some ideas. Maybe people had a car-free day, they took the train to work, and then they had to run some errands at their lunch break, so they walked. So they saw a lot more of these bouts of physical activity just due to the fact that transit was there. And then this other study, LaChapelle and Noland, transit commuting was they looked at transit commuting as a predictor of whether or not you walked. And transit commuting predicted pretty well whether you took additional walking trips for all sorts of purposes, going to the store, going to a restaurant, walking the dog. And this held up whether you were walking to the transit station or making use of a park and ride facility. So even if you're driving to transit, the fact that you're using transit is associated with you walking more. So that was a pretty powerful finding for transit having some sort of effect above and beyond just built environment features. There we go. But this does leave us with some unanswered questions. These studies didn't do too much to control for individual preferences and attitudes. And this is a big one, because if you live in a corridor and you drop a light rail in it, the same innate travel preferences that you might have that make you more likely to take transit could be the very same ones that make you more likely to walk. So being able to look at these individual preferences and see if those are what's causing this difference is important. And a lot of them also made use of longitudinal studies, which are really good for establishing causality, but they don't tell us what's the contribution of these individual built environment features. So understanding this is really important because it's got implications for how we design our transit facilities. If we understand what built environment features support walking in addition to or that drive transit, then we know what we need to do with these corridors to really maximize that investment and use it as a tool to shift people out of their cars into any mode. So our goal with the study is to really look at this question about whether transit's causing people to walk more, whether we're seeing those carryover walking trips where people are just making extra walking trips because the Hiawatha light rail is there. And we're looking at both the effect of the transit facility, and we're controlling for specific built environment features that will kind of tell us what we're looking for as far as a good transit and pedestrian environment. This is using data from the same study as our transit study. So it was the survey we did in May 2011. Where it's the same corridor, so I'm not going to repeat all this too much for you. And we're looking at the same urban control corridors. We've got Hiawatha as our study, and then we've got Nicollet and Bloomington Avenues from Lake to 50th. We're matching on that connected street grid, some demographics, intense transit use. Everything Jason said. And these are just our two suburban control corridors. And you can see we picked them because we were looking for a good demographic match, but we wanted that distinctly suburban post-1970s curvilinear street pattern. So that's what you can see here with, minimal transit service. There's some pretty good commuter routes through here, but not the same level that you'd see along Nicollet Avenue, for example. And so in this study, we used a lot of different factors. We really wanted to understand what makes people take walking trips. So we looked at their residential preferences and travel attitudes, something that was missing in a lot of the literature we reviewed. Both the perceived and objective built environment around their house in these transit corridors, demographics, and then just the presence or absence of that corridor facility and what corridor they lived in. We used a negative binomial regression model since we were predicting the number of days during the week, the past 7 days before they took the survey, on which they walked to the store or walked just to go for a stroll. And so we're using these two types of walking trips sort of as proxies for recreational walking and utilitarian walking. So this is just looking at walking across our corridors, not including any of those other factors we talked about, just comparing. And so what we're seeing already is for strolling trips or recreational walking trips, the behaviors across corridors are pretty similar. Not too much is significant here. The biggest differences are in the percentage of people who are walking at least once. And you can see the difference is really between Burnsville and then Hiawatha Bloomington. And that really is just pointing to a suburban-urban split more so than anything else. For our utilitarian store trips, there actually is quite a bit of difference. But again, a lot of it seems to map to this urban-suburban split. We've got the Coon Rapids and Burnsville are similar to each other, but significantly different from the urban corridors. We do notice here, which is kind of interesting, Nicollet has higher frequencies of walking and higher participation in walking, whether they'll walk at least once to the store, than either of our urban corridors, including Hiawatha. So that's kind of setting us up with a lot of questions as far as, well, is Hiawatha making people walk more? Well, they already walk more on Nicollet, but maybe we can get into some of the other factors and see what's really going on. So here's the model that we did for walking to the store. We controlled for a lot of the demographic factors we talked about. What's really interesting here is that as far as predicting walking trips, or the number of days on which you went for a walking trip to the store, commercial land use is a really important factor. This incident rate ratio means that each additional percentage point of commercial land use within the area around your house that we analyzed makes you about 4 times more likely to or walk about 4 times more. And that should seem pretty intuitive. You need stores nearby if you're going to walk to the store. Population density was also a big factor, and then network interruptions. So the number of cul-de-sacs or dead-end streets in the area around your house that would hinder your path towards walking to the store. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a little bit, but that was a pretty important factor. Interestingly, here we see that these corridors are not significant, meaning that after you control for the built environment and all these demographic factors, Hiawatha is not coming out as a significant predictor of walking trips. And we looked at this through several different phases of our model. Specifically, when you put everything in the model except our corridors, or except the built environment variables, I should say, the corridors do come out as significant. And in fact, we see the suburbs having a negative effect and then Nicollet having that positive effect above Hiawatha. But once you control for the built environment, the corridor variables are no longer significant. So that's telling us that something about the built environment is explaining why Nicollet seems to have more walking than Hiawatha. And so that's pretty notable. Looking at recreational walking, this seemed to be much more a function of individual preferences and travel attitudes. As far as the built environment factors go, stuff that we can really plan for when we think about transit facilities, network interruptions. Again, those cul-de-sacs and dead-end streets were really the only thing that came out significant in the model. If you're just going for a casual stroll, you don't necessarily need a lot of commercial land use near you, I guess was one of the takeaways. So just to kind of conclude the data section, we found the Hiawatha didn't seem to have a distinct effect, a distinct positive effect on walking. After controlling for built environment, we found no significant difference between Hiawatha and the other corridors. But the built environment did bring it into similar contexts with Nicollet, which had previously looked like it had more walking. Walking was definitely associated with some specific built environment factors that we can consider when we plan corridors. Those network interruptions, population density, and commercial land use. And here, like I just said, built environment variables erase the differences between corridors, including suburban corridors. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong way. So here's one of those big implications. The network interruptions that I've talked about, they were a really big factor for both store trips and strolling trips. And so this is what Hiawatha and Nicollet look like. I'm sure you've seen these maps. You look at Nicollet, and there's some issues along the freeway corridor, but along Nicollet Avenue, it's a pretty well-connected street grid. You don't have to detour too far to get to Nicollet. There are bus stops not labeled on this map, but all up and down the corridor. On Hiawatha, since it's adjacent to a highway and an industrial corridor and a heavy rail line, and it's on a diagonal, you see a lot of these places where the local streets have been cut off or end just before the corridor, and there's a big sound barrier there. So if you live like here and you want to get to 38th Street Station, you can't just take the shortest path along the diagonal. You have to detour quite a ways, and that has implications for walking for any purpose. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. Okay, and another big takeaway is corridor planning and those compatible land uses that will support walking to the store. Jason talked about these a little bit, so I won't spend too much time, but we did see proximity to commercial areas coming out in the store model as a really, really big predictor of walking. So if you look at Nicollet Avenue, all of this red along Nicollet Avenue is commercial land use. You look at Hiawatha, all this dark gray is industrial. And so this is 38th Street and 42nd, and showing the same scale in both maps. But you can really see how big of an impact that land use has just on what's right by the corridor, right where our station area survey respondents are living as far as destinations to walk to and environments to walk through. So that industrial corridor and the lower level of commercial land use seem to make a really big difference. And finally, we have to think about designing for all road users. When you look at Nicollet Avenue, it's a street, it's 2 lanes, it's a reasonable level of traffic. You look at Hiawatha, and the light rail line is next to what's basically a freeway, and it's not very comfortable to walk along Hiawatha Avenue or to cross these streets. This is from Bing Maps Street View. You can see to cross from one side to the other, it's about 5 lanes, very high volume, high speed traffic. So it's not particularly pleasant to get to the station or just to walk around. But we seem to be learning from this. So this is a map out of the station area planning for Central Corridor of the Snelling Street station. And I thought this was an interesting comparison because Snelling and University are both quite high volume streets, but with the Central Corridor, they're making a concerted effort as they're planning the corridor itself to plan for connectivity to the station. So in the future, I think it'd be really interesting to study what happens here and see if we actually do see a light rail bonus for walking, because they're using that light rail as an opportunity to invest in facilities that make it more pleasant for walking as well. So and that's what I just said. Future research looking into how walking plays out in corridors that we're planning a little differently. So, thank you. I think Jason and I will take questions now.
All right, thanks to our presenters. We'll take questions. Anybody have a question for either?
What was the total number of respondents in the Hiawatha corridor? And then did you check to see if there's any difference between folks east or west of Highway 55 in terms of their propensity to use transit?
In terms of the total number of respondents, we have about 300. And then in terms of the Hiawatha, I think it's about 600, around that number. And that's a good suggestion. We didn't check east part and west part. So maybe this is something we can do in the future research. Good point.
This is for Jesse. Can you put back the map of Hiawatha that you had, like the previous slide with the land uses? Yeah, that one.
Yep.
So, based on what you're saying, in terms of getting people to walk, and in terms of what Jason was saying, and getting people to ride transit, would it have made more sense in retrospect to run the light rail line up Minnehaha Avenue instead of running it where it actually wound up, because there's already more commercial use there, it's a former streetcar corridor and so on?
Well, I haven't particularly studied the Minnehaha corridor that well, but just looking at the land use maps, this does look a lot more like Nicollet. And you'd still have this barrier here that would cut off some of the western residents and also might make the area a little less attractive to move into, at least for this strip of it, until land uses can get converted. But you'd think that wouldn't be all that different from this big barrier here, and Nicollet still seems to have pretty high levels of transit use and walking. So that is an interesting suggestion. Jason?
Okay, I want to add a little bit. And of course, I was not here when the Hiawatha was built. So that means I have a limited understanding about history. But I think, for the Hiawatha, because we have the right of way. So that means, it's very easy for us to find this route. And then in terms of the Minnehaha, my speculation is, maybe the street is narrow, we don't really have the right of way, and then we have the strong opposition from the residents. So that means we're choosing a route with the least resistance. So that means, we can see this problem. And then I also want to make a little bit of the inference regarding the Bottineau light rail transit. A few days we just heard about the locally preferred alternative regarding the Bottineau. It turns out, it's going to be, a route going through, running along the BNSF. And then, I'm not sure, that's really a good route for that Bottineau light rail transit. Because, if we run that area, it's a park, and then that's the railroad. So that means what's the development potential for that? And then we're spending millions of dollars on this rail transit, and then we don't see any development potential. So I'm not sure this is the right decision.
two comments, and maybe you can talk about them. Jason, on your work, I think it'd be kind of interesting to look at how oriented the Hiawatha corridor is to downtown. Where do the people that live in that part of South Minneapolis go? And maybe if it had the demographics and affluence more like Uptown or Lyndale or Hennepin, that might be different. And then on Jesse's stuff, very interesting stuff, and I kind of think that maybe a future place to look at some of this research would be at what kind of small commercial there is on Nicollet versus the Hiawatha corridor. I'm thinking like, retail is more practical if there's actually something to get as opposed to just Doritos and cigarettes, which is most of the retail that's along Minnehaha. So, anyways.
Thanks. That's a really good point.
I had one question in mind. I'll get to that in a second. But as far as the diagonal goes and where you put a route or not, we have another diagonal coming down the pike, and the draft environmental impact statement is out for it right now, Southwest LRT. And then there are instances where there's railroads and other uses and whatnot. And so development potential is huge. And then what you do in the vicinity of the station is huge. And I remember a quote from Commissioner McLaughlin, with LRT, we're behind the curve. With St. Paul, we're just in time. With Southwest, we're trying to get out ahead. I'm not familiar with the Botno, but it doesn't really seem to matter to me if you're going on diagonals and have some of this industrial use, as long as the stations themselves are have a lot of development potential. And it seems like you don't have to have every station have that huge amount of development potential, because it seems like we're doing great things on the south, and downtown is growing leaps and bounds. So the standard shouldn't be every station has all this great potential or whatever. So, but you're doing interesting work. But another feature that I'm finding in certain corridors isn't so much an aggregate. It's actually more related to design. And I'm not a planner or designer, but I call it fake fenestration. If you ever hear about, for planning and transit-oriented districts or pedestrian-oriented districts, you have to have so much stuff kind of on the wall, windows. Well, if you go to Trader Joe's in St. Louis Park, Excelsior Boulevard, Excelsior and Grand's got a lot of accolades, but there's a lot of bad stuff there. You can walk 2 blocks, and it's all fake fenestration. So if you can, and there's other examples elsewhere, so I don't know how you might be able to take in design features into your analysis or for future work. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, specifically looking at the diagonal, I guess my concern was that it then cuts off all of these local streets at an angle. But if you've got another diagonal coming along and you maintain that connectivity so that you're not detouring, if you're cut off here, you have to walk all the way up and around, so that you're not cutting off that natural flow. Then I don't know if diagonal is necessarily the problem, just the way it's executed here. As far as that design, I'm not sure. Do you see any easy opportunities for studying that?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. But maybe we need to wait for a few more years. So in that case, we can study the Southwest. That's a very good point, right?
So I find the result that, if I understand this correctly, that movers into the Hiawatha corridor did not have as great a propensity, no more propensity to ride transit than the control corridors. A little bit counterintuitive, of course, and especially given prior research that I believe showed that the Hiawatha line tended to result in an increase in housing prices adjacent to the stations, which suggests that people are moving into the corridor for some reason and willing to pay a premium to move there, presumably to be able to ride transit. And you mentioned, I think, that there are about 1,000 new housing units, and I wasn't sure if that was in the Hiawatha corridor or among all 3 corridors. But of course, we know that there has not been a significant amount of housing development, at least between 50th and Lake, on the Hiawatha corridor since the line opened. And I'm wondering if you have a sense that as that development does start to occur, so I guess my point being maybe there hasn't been as much opportunity for people to move into the corridors, or perhaps where in Nicollet corridor and Bloomington probably also has had little new housing development. So I guess my question really is, do you think as some of the new developments that are coming online in the Hiawatha corridor, 38th Street and 46th Street, as you start to see some of that development, do you think that might have some change in these results in terms of as there's more housing availability, as you said, maybe more affordable housing availability, if that might lead to a change in that result?
To some extent, I would say. Because, think about the Nicollet Avenue, and that corridor is really kind of, it's kind of mixed income, right? And then for the Hiawatha, it's really because the Hiawatha, lateral transit corridors drove the price up. So, actually, a lot of people, they come here. Yes, some of them come here for the transit. Yeah, they value the access. But some of them see this is kind of potential, for their, investment. And, even for those people who value the transit, they come here, because they're choice riders. So that means they use, the transit for commute, but not necessarily for the number trip. And then for this kind of the transit-oriented development, we really need to, internalize trips. So the internalized trips, including, within this station area. So that means, if this station area is really a destination, we see the development, it's a human-oriented development. So in that case, the people are willing to walk there, and then they are going to do the business. So in that case, instead of driving outside, so they can do the business within this TOD side. And on the other hand is, we can think about the whole corridor. If, yes, we don't really have this kind of development here, but we have the development at another station. So that means I may just take this rail transit to reach another, station area. So that means I can still do my business. So in this case, it's going to internalize my trip within this corridor. But if we, the station area is really not a destination, so that means, it's hard, for even we have the low-income people coming in, and then it's still difficult for them to use the transit.
A couple of observations. One is a cautionary note that even though Hiawatha has been up and running for about 8 years, drawing too many conclusions with respect to TOD and particularly how people are behaving, we just need to be cautious, in part because it's only been 8 years, in part because the development environment in this country has been moribund. And so it's worthy doing these studies, but it's probably a little early. A second note is that I remember when we were talking initially about how far people would be willing to walk to LRT stations as opposed to bus stations. We were using approximately a quarter mile, and FTA kind of went back and forth, but finally said, no, you need to look at impacts out about a half a mile. And I understand from Metro Transit that the average walk-up distance now is approaching half a mile. And quite honestly, there were a lot of people in this region that did not believe people would be willing to walk a half mile to the station. Final thing that I would say about routing, some of the questions on routing. I've worked mostly on Central Corridor, and we did look at the I-94 corridor to put the LRT. We also looked at Burlington Northern as a north parallel. And we selected University Avenue. Actually, the city pushed University Avenue when the county and the region were really pushing I-94. But now we will have a real different kind of alignment to look at in terms of people's behavior. And then on Southwest, even a third. So again, it's good to do these studies, but in the sweep of the impact that they'll see, it's awfully early.
Yeah, so, first, I think to some extent I agree with your point. It's only about 80 years. But look at BART, it's already 20 years. The Professor Bob Severo and John Landis, they published a paper regarding the 20 years after BART. And then they didn't really see big development around, especially on the east part of the BART system. And so this is the reason, but also this is the excuse. And then for this second. What's the second? So can you remind me the second point?
Well, the second point was about walking distance, how
Oh.
far people were willing to walk to stations.
Yeah, and actually, I have done another study, a few years ago, and then I tried to come up with the walking distance for the Hiawatha residents. Yes, actually, we can see the density decay function, and actually, from that study, we found out the median walking distance is a little bit less than 0.4 mile for the Hiawatha Railroad Transit, and of course, some people they walk more than a mile. So, we do see, this kind of the variation, but, unfortunately, for the planning practice, it seems we always use half a mile as the catchment area for the railroad transit, and then for the bus, it's about a quarter mile. And then the third one is?
The context.
Yes, and that create a very good opportunity, for us to look at, how the different routing and then is going to change, this story. And actually, I'm glad, I see, the route of the central corridor is along the University Avenue, because that's a mixed-use avenue that opens a lot of opportunities for the development and also for the pedestrian connection. And then, also we talk about the southwest. Actually, there are two different routes, right? So one route is really also along the real corridor, but it turns out, we try to use the inner. We're going to run through the Edina and Minnetonka, and then go to the Eden Prairie instead of using the route along the real corridor. So you can see, we're learning something, right? For the southwest. But also, we forget something for the Baltimore.
Any additional questions for the presenters? Got one more here.
Jason, I was wondering if I could ask a little bit more about the survey instrument itself, how it was administered and what variables it was designed to collect and so forth.
The survey, we have these 5 corridors. We have the Hiawatha corridor, and then we have 2 urban controls and 2 suburban controls. We sent about 2,000 survey to the residents living the Hiawatha corridor, and then 1,000 for each of those control corridors. And then in terms of the mover and non-mover, we have about 50-50 split. And of course, for different corridors and then for different mover and non-movers, we have different response rate. But it's along, that 20% rate. And then in terms of the questions, we ask the respondents regarding their, their perceived neighborhood attributes for their residents. The residential neighborhoods, and then also we ask about their, the importance of those attributes when they were looking for a place to live. We ask about their, the preference in terms of travel. For example, do you like transit or not, or blah, blah, blah. And also, we have demographic information. We measure their travel behavior in terms of general. So that means we didn't do it using a travel diary survey. So we just ask them about some general indicator. So, in terms of the walking, we ask them, how many days did you walk to a commercial area, a local shopping area during the last 7 days. And then for the community trips, we have an ordinal scale. And then, we try to come up with an internal scale from that scale.
Well, please join me in thanking our speakers, Jason and Jessica. And as we wrap up, I'll just mention that there are professional development hour forms in the meeting packets. If you're at the back of the room, there are a few extras if you're interested in taking one of those PDH forms. Our next seminar will be next Thursday, October 25th, 3:30 here in this room. And Jeff Marr, who's the Associate Director of Engineering and Facilities at the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory here at the U of M, will be speaking, and his topic is culvert pipe materials and durability, making the right selection for Minnesota. So with that, I thank you for attending and hope you can join us for a future seminar. Thanks.